We're recording now. All right. So they know me. Go ahead and tell them who you are, ma'am.
I am Sabrina Schumann. I primarily teach English. Um, I have a master's in English education, and I have taught full time, right? The full term, everything from fifth grade English and social studies to um, senior year literature and composition.
Awesome. So I know, like, I wanted to talk to you because I know you have that like range.
Breath,
That you've
yes.
taught my grade that I teach, and then you've taught older kids. And while this is like all about middle grade, I also want to talk a little bit about young adult and
Hmm.
how different that is now. So it was really interesting because we talk a little bit about how, like, at least you and I talked about how we talked earlier. I think I might put clips in about that when we had our first conversation about sort of talking about setting this up
Yeah.
and those mirrors, right? Mirrors and windows situation where I had no mirrors, I had windows. And you said yourself, you made a mention like you didn't have the opportunity to have windows, right? Because what you had at home did not include anything that you would have had that. But
I
talk
didn't see the characters did not like yes, they were FEMA presenting white kids, which is what I am, but I still didn't they were still not close enough to me for me to feel like that was a mirror. It was like, okay, you are the kids who make my life hell.
right.
Awesome.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And that's such a big deal because I think the older we get, the more, we branch out and search for success. I mean, I think that's why I like sci-fi and fantasy when I was growing up, because just the contemporary books, the contemporary fiction that I found at that time was not in any way anything I could necessarily connect with. Like, I read the Babysitters Club and stuff like that, and I didn't hate them. I thought they were funny or whatever. And that had like slight diversity in it, right? It had a little bit of like something in it. And I think that maybe that's had something to do with Anne herself, because I mean Anne's queer. And so like I wonder if she maybe tried to include some more than just your regular straight white kid in her books, because she herself,
Mhm.
while she is white, she is not a straight woman. So like I wondered, because that's another thing. Like nowadays, the Babysitters Club is way more inclusive. I don't know if like they've got things like that. Um, but other than that, I like none like, yeah, we talked about Sweet Valley High. That was not something I ever liked. Like, not at all. And I think what I read was like horror, like R.L. Stein and like Christopher Pike.
I
And
love that stuff. I'm so excited. Did you see Are You Afraid of the Dark is back?
yes, I was very excited about that. And that's so funny because it was like, yeah, but like that was something I connected with more because it was like weird stuff happening and just outside of like the norm. And I think that's why I like fantasy. It's all outside the norm. Like, it was like not everyone is the same. And aliens were different people. So
Yeah,
that
I
was
mean,
possibly why I love sci-fi so much.
yeah, and I think that that's part of still why a lot of kids who are not like the most popular Sweet Valley High like humans in the schools still respond to things like Star Wars and Star Trek and Lord of the Rings, and
Yes.
because it is a reality in which you are not expecting your social experiences to be replicated.
Right. It's exactly it. Yes. Specifically Star Trek. We talked about Star Wars because Star Wars is a little bit more white people savior kind of.
Yes, but you do have a lot of races of
Yes.
people that
Yes.
are not.
Yeah, and that's the good thing. Yes, I was about to say yes. It did have a diverse group of like all
Yeah.
kinds of races everywhere. I think the thing is though, I liked how Roddenberry wasn't afraid to put people of color in his show as main characters.
Yes, very much so.
So Nayota, like, like he was not afraid to say, yeah, like these people exist in the future. I was talking about this the other day. I was watching this podcast or listening to a podcast with David Tennant, right?
Mhm.
And then he did this podcast and was talking to a lot of famous friends, but it was just like a sit down, let's chat about things kind of like podcast. And one of the people he's speaking to is Whoopi Goldberg, which I thought was great. I was like, how did you all even know each other? But
Such fun.
Whoopi Goldberg, she is apparently a huge sci-fi fan. So she loved Doctor Who her entire life since she was like a little kid. And so like I guess she must have interviewed him at some point and they just got really friendly and like kept in touch and stuff. And so he was talking to her and she said something that I was kind of flabbergasted about. But then when you thought about it, you were like, oh, that's probably right. She said, when Roddenberry came out with like Next Generation and LeVar Burton was in it, she knew LeVar as a friend. And so she told him, you let them know that I will play any part, right, in Star Trek. She's like, I would love to play anything. Like whatever. And so he was like, oh, okay, I will. And so like I guess he told them, but they didn't believe him that Whoopi Goldberg wanted to be on Star Trek. So like I guess the next time she saw him, she was like, did you tell him? He's like, yeah, I did, but they didn't believe me. So she's like, well, give me a number. And he's like, I've got Gene's number, like Roddenberry. And she was like, well, give me Gene Roddenberry's number. So she called him up and, you know, asked to meet with him just because she really wanted, like she was pitching like, hey, let me just be on the show. And so he was like, yeah, sure. So he had like a meeting with her and she told him, she's like, I want to be on your show because you were the first time in my life that I saw a Black person in space in the future. She said she watched sci-fi since she was a little kid. Star Trek was the first time she saw herself in the future, the possibility that Black people existed in the future. And he was like he was a little like, what? And she was like, really? And I guess like they chit chat and he was like, yeah. And so like, then he called her back up and was like, he was like, you're right. Like apparently he researched and tried to find like somewhere else that they might have found, and they didn't. He didn't. He was apparently possibly one of the first people to ever say, yeah, like people of color exist.
Well, future.
Yeah, they're not just like whatever, you know. And I thought that was really, I was a little like taken aback. I didn't even realize. I was like, wow, that's
I mean, I completely believe that because what did you have that was science fiction before that?
right.
Right? Like you had the Twilight Zone.
Right. And that's all white.
Yep. And you had like the post-atomic fear movies, right?
Right.
And the fear monger movies of like the day the earth stood still and all of that stuff. And that was all white people.
Yep. You had things
That was
like
all white people.
Plan 9 from Outer Space. That was like the cheesy, like sci-fi, like ones. That was all. Yeah. So I mean, like once you really think down, you sit to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
So like her entire life until like the 60s showed up. Like where he.
Well, I mean, you have to like the social structure at the time backed that choice, and that's what really frustrates me, right? Because you had segregation in filming, and you could only have Black people do servile tasks, right? Like that was the accepted norm. But in the future, servile tasks are being done by robots and machines.
Right.
And so we can't cast them because we can't cast them as full people because segregation and racism and bleh.
Right. Which just brings us now because like, okay, that was the 60s, right? That was the feel of the time. But we're in the 2020s now. And you still have almost no representation to speak of in books. It's better. It's better, but yeah. It's better in media like movies and shows. But in books, there's still so little representation and not just representation, but own voices, which is the big deal. Right.
Yes. And I think that's the newest piece to it, because one of the things that I remember, right, because we were kids in the early 80s, which was when that first generation of people who went to desegregated schools hit creator mode.
Right.
And so you and I actually had this very small pocket of multiculturalism when we were kids.
Yes.
And it was, I mean, if you remember back to Captain Planet.
Yes.
That was multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
Right? The characters were from different places around the world. They had accents from their actual languages. They had cultures that were being represented. Now, that show didn't last very long because it was, I mean, it was really repetitive and Captain Planet was hilarious, but blue. And,
Right.
right? But like that was a moment for us. We got Sesame Street, right? We got all of these things that had we got the Muppets, right? Like all
Right.
of these things that were very clearly about difference and difference being okay but
And
the
not just
public
and celebrated. Differences
yes,
celebrated. Yeah.
yeah, and like not unproblematic but also
Yeah.
not unwelcome, right? Gonzo was always weird. Gonzo was always like eyebrow raising me like what the fuck. But
Side note, real quick. I want to put this
Gonzo's trans or Gonzo's
out
non-binary,
there.
yes, I'm
Yeah,
very excited
that
about
was
that.
great. That moment was amazing. I was like, that's all.
Well, and people pointed out that Gonzo has always been othered, right? Like we don't know what species Gonzo is.
Right.
Gonzo has worn dresses and wigs before. Like this is not new for Gonzo.
Yeah.
Um but like but we had that, right? Um and and a lot of that stuff went backwards. Right? Even the TV shows that we watched. Like we had and I hate that this is ruined, but we had the Cosby show.
Yeah.
Every kid I knew wanted to be a Huxtable.
Yeah.
I still sort of. I mean, it a separate of that whole other thing. I'd still be a Huxtable today,
I
right? Different world,
that's the
right?
one
We
that's the one I would live in.
and yes, and different strokes, and we had all of these TV shows that were just on mainstream television.
Mhm.
They were just on the networks,
And that started in the late 80s and 90s.
and
Because
then they all went away.
yeah, it Living Color. Remember Living Color? That
I
which was
loved In Living Color. What
Living
was the
Living
this
Single?
Living
That was
Single?
fantastic. Yeah. Hmm.
Yep. All of that stuff.
Yeah.
We had all of that stuff, and then it rolled back,
Yes.
right?
We
It
talked.
rolled back, and it segregated. So like stuff that was still getting made because there was like the Martin Lawrence TV show, and some of that stuff moved to like BET. It moved to its own channel, but we had to have cable, right?
Yeah.
It
Mhm.
wasn't on like Fox and stuff anymore. And I remember like even I don't know that you watched Young and the Restless, but Young and the Restless did the same thing where they had the long time housekeepers like granddaughter. There were all of these black characters and romances going on there. um like Shamar Mar eventually is one of the like love interests who's on that show. Like all of that stuff was there for a while, and like it disappeared,
Mhm.
right? And so I think those voices got like
Silent.
they that people weren't paying enough attention, right? People weren't saying, "Hey, why isn't there a black actor? Hey, why isn't this?" Well, like there wasn't the feeling that they had to anymore, and so the former practices just reasserted themselves. And I don't know that in the publishing industry that ever
Not so
that
much.
that occurred. I
No.
don't remember that occurring in books, but I also wasn't really reading at that stage of the game.
Right. I mean,
Right? I don't really.
I was, but I wouldn't have been cognitively like I would not have been consciously reading and looking for that. Like I wasn't an adult yet, right? I wasn't going to be looking at it and like looking at the behind what's happening behind the scenes in publishing and in books, right? I would have been just consuming the books.
Mhm.
I mean, and there were things here and there, but yeah, like I mean, I cannot recall in my childhood like anything that was like inclusive in any way, like inclusive in the term that it was like a major character, like right in the face, like the main leader, the main it was never a person of color ever. And even now, which is frustrating, while you have a little bit more like inclusion for Latinx and like black characters, the Asian characters, the Muslim characters, the like a Pacific Islander character, like any other like culture isn't represented yet really as much. Like I think they're 1%, if that, of publishing. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's not saying that the rest of us are great. I think it's 7% Latinx and maybe like 12, 15% Black. Still not okay. Like we're nowhere near what we should be.
No, one of the things I remember, I read an article recently that was talking about how in children's pictures books, there are more books about animal characters
Talk
than
about in
about
class.
people of color. And that wasn't like Black kids or Asian kids or Latinx, like people of color, full stop.
Yeah. We
And
were
that's
in class. Yeah. Like
atrocious.
that's like still, it's still a thing. I think it's better, but it is still a thing. And that includes also queer, like trying to find I had a classmate who was trying to find a picture book for like the younger elementary kids about, queer characters, LGBT representation, and she couldn't find
Um,
anything with people. She could find things with like animals or things with, like objects, but not quite as many with actual like people as the characters. And that's still
I have not, I do not possess it yet, but I'm gonna say the drag queens go swish, swish, swish. It's the wheels on the bus, but for drag queens.
Oh, that's awesome.
I highly recommend that get added to her show.
Oh, that's so cute. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, and even the drag queens on the color cover
Oh, that's
are not like a single representation of what it means to be in drag.
right.
I like it. I don't own it yet, so like I can't wholeheartly say that there's no problems in it, but just the concept alone makes me happy.
Yes, I love that. Like, and so like that's why I thought this was such an interesting thing to look at as instead Spence in terms of genre, because middle grade is making a comeback. Like
Mhm.
middle grade to me, like even more than YA, especially more than new adult or like adult fiction. Middle grade has in the last, I want to say 3 to 4 years, had this incredible like influx of own voices and like cultural representation that I haven't seen in a long time, probably ever in publishing. And it's middle grade, which I thought was so interesting. Because if you go look for YA, not so much. Like there's still a lot, right? But not to the extent that it is a middle grade. And I feel like we were just talking about how when we were just like kids and that generation was coming in, I think this is the generation behind us who are now adults coming in. And it's this generation speaking, which I find like really good.
Well, you also have our generation has middle grade age kids.
That's true. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
not you and I, but our generation.
Weird space. You and I are in that weird space between millennials, right? And like we're not quite generation Z or X or whatever. Like,
Whatever those letters were.
yeah, whatever they were.
We're the
Like
pocket generation.
we
We're
were
the mini Polly Pocket generation.
like that in that weird space, right? I talk about it all the time. Like I tell my kids, like I was in the generation that knew what it's like to not have computers do everything and knows what it's like to
Or
have to
anything.
do everything. Like, I mean, like we're that like they'll never know what it's like not to have a computer or some kind of technology help in their life. They'll never know what that is because their entire lives it's been a thing. But I feel like we were the last generation to have that tiny pocket where technology hadn't quite had that zoom, like trajectory where it just went like insanely just out there, and we still had that weird space. Like we were like personal computers were still really starting to come in when we were kids, and like cell
Tetris.
phones were starting to kind of
That's
come in.
all we had. We had Tetris and Solitaire
Yeah, pretty
on the
much.
family computer
Yes,
that lived in like the living room or the dining room.
yes, that big
It was a totally different thing. We had dot matrix printers. I remember when like laser printers came out. We're like, ooh, look at all this. No,
I
this
know.
is a totally different world.
It's absolutely 100%. And so I think you're right. I think that our generation also has that, like they're coming up, and it's like it's interesting to see that, like, that happening with middle grade especially.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping it's a trend that keeps going, and I'm hoping it bleeds into,
As it continues through
as
the.
it continues, it bleeds into young adult as well as adult, but also backwards into children's literature. Like 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 the little ones. Like there's not enough for the little ones, to be fair. You
Mhm.
know, we need a
Mhm.
lot more. I mean, there's stuff out there. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. And a lot of like I know Grace, I don't know if Grace Lynn has, but I know Kwame no, maybe Grace Lynn has like a children's book. And you've got people like Jason Reynolds, who's amazing, who's doing children's literature, like literal
He's doing
picture book.
all of it.
He's amazing. Kwame
I don't know when he
Alexander,
sleeps, but he's doing all of it.
Kwame Alexander, who does like both, he's doing children's books. So it's like I'm really hoping that,
Ibram X. Kendi.
yes, yes,
Right?
yes. So I'm really hoping that that continues to happen as a trend. Like those that are in here go backwards and are like, yeah, let's obviously do some stuff for the younger kids as well, because they just don't have enough. But in looking at it, I mean, it was really a relief to see so much good stuff in middle grade. Because I mean, when we were growing up, there was really good things in middle grade. I mean, I still say like Lord of the Rings is still a great book to read regardless. It's a good book to read because it really has a lot for kids to, middle graders to get from, like, you know, those, the kids. The Dark is Rising series, which I really enjoyed as a kid. I think that was such a great like story, like as a fantasy story. That was a really good one. Um, while and this was beyond our generation. But while I'm not a fan of the author, the Harry Potter series was good in terms of bringing fantasy to middle grade and really making it a thing. And this was not necessarily her, but I appreciated the casting of it because they did try to cast with the thought of casting not just white kids, right? They like did cast a few more. I mean, the three main were white kids, but I mean, that was the way it was in the book. But they cast a lot of the surrounding characters that weren't necessarily said in the book to be, right, like a character of
Were
color.
any of them I don't, I'm trying to think of how many times skin color is actually mentioned for any of the characters though, right? And it's not. And one of the things like that is both a criticism,
Mhm.
right? Making color like
Invisible.
ignoring that part of a character's characterization, right?
Right.
But also that it assumes white to be the default, right?
Exactly.
Unless I tell you this character is Asian, like Cho Chang, right? Just from her name.
Right.
Unless I tell you that this character is Asian, this character is white,
Right.
right? That assumptive level. And so I do like when you can sort of put your own experience on a group, right? Because it's not, they're not saying over and over again how white they are,
Right.
right? You can just sort of imagine their race to be whatever you like feel you need to fill in there. But at the same time, that does erase a fair bit of like experience.
Right.
But one of the things that I think is nice about that series is that it talks about clearly levels of class and otherness, right? The mudbloods. And
Mhm.
even though the Weasleys are purebloods, they're still looked down upon by
Right.
the racist dickheads. Can we
Right.
call them that?
Right. Yes.
Um, but I think that it's interesting,
Yes.
and you're right. Like, and I think I wasn't as into fantasy at that age as you were. I mean, because I'd only just started reading. And the thing that I responded most to was like others in the historical past.
Mm.
Right. So I was reading stories about with like people who were accused of witchcraft.
Right.
Right. And I was reading stories about surviving the Civil War and like, being somebody who was for the North while you were stuck in the South kind of a thing.
Yes.
Um because I was looking for that I am stuck here, but I am still different than everybody else experience because that's what I felt.
Right.
and I was looking for that mirror. I was able to find it. I don't know that you, I mean, you weren't. I mean, even in fantasy and science fiction, you weren't really able to find that mirror.
Not really. I mean, not till I was much older because I was looking for it. I was digging. Like
Mhm.
as a and that's where it is. As a kid, you can't dig. Like as an adult, as a young adult, as an adult where you have your own money a lot of the time and your own time, you can go look. As a young kid, you can't. That has to be accessible. And that's the I think that's the big deal. It was not accessible.
Well, here's the other question, right? Because I think that this makes a big, I think both of us sort of had this experience because of our age. Um, we could really only read books we could get from the library. I mean, my family wasn't buying books that weren't Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High because those were my older siblings, right? I mean, hundreds of those books if I
Mhm.
wanted to read them, which I didn't. And then the only other option was for me to start reading what my parents were reading, which is actually what I did. So if I couldn't find stuff from the library I actually wanted to read, then I had to start reading adult fiction that was in my house.
Right.
And that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah.
Um,
It's so funny. That is why I tell people they think I'm crazy. That's why I read Shakespeare at 11. It was accessible. We were at Woolworths, if anyone remembers Woolworths, and there was like a book, and it was literally the collected works of Shakespeare. It was one of the really like big thick volumes or whatever. And I begged my mom, it was like really cheap, and she was like, "Yeah, sure, you can have it." And I read,
and you
like,
wanted it because it was big.
yeah, it was a big book. It was hardcover. I was like, "Oh, this is cool." And I mean, I read it. Did I understand it? No, but I read it. I mean, later, as I was older, it kind of helped that I had read it before because I mean, I understood it way more obviously as when I was older. And I was like, "Oh yeah, I kind of read this once," and you have to read Shakespeare a few times. So that was helpful. But yeah, like that was accessible. I could get it there, and I really thought, "Oh, that's a cool book. It's big. Let me get it." But I mean, it was not age appropriate for me. And a lot of stuff happening in it at the time I didn't understand.
No.
I did still think the language was pretty. I remember thinking it was really pretty, like the way it was written, but like I don't even know that I really took it in, obviously, until I was way, way older and I could read it. But yeah, it's accessibility. We had the library. And so like the library's free, but it is not always accessible to everyone. Is it accessible in like poor neighborhoods where there are a lot of like people of color? No. No, that was a thing that happened out here not that long ago that really upset me. And we tried very hard to save this library, but there was a very small library, very small library. It was mostly kids that used it. It was a very small library in oh God, what's it called? I can't remember the area right now what it's called, but there was like a trailer park right across the street from it. Like, and the kids from there were all pretty much immigrant children. And so they would be able to walk from their like house to the like library on weekends and like get books. And the library was great at just letting kids get library cards. They didn't even like they didn't care. Like, they weren't like, show me. They were like, no, come and get a library card. And so they closed that down for those kids. That
Why?
library got closed. I don't remember why it got closed. It was like money maybe or whatever, or they built a much nicer a much nicer one, but it was far away from them. And I'm like, but accessibility. Like it was very frustrating.
Yeah.
And I mean, and that's another problem. While there are more middle grade books and things that are now own voices, because like all the ones that I read, and I'm going to show these now, so talk about it. Grace Lynn, right? Own voices. Um, Call Me Mabalia, own voices. This is exceptional. You should pick this up. You'd love this. And then Maya and the Rising Dark, which is Rena Barron, all own voices, right? Which is great. But are they accessible to kids? Depending on where they live. Like,
Yeah.
or if your parents can afford to buy them for you, or if they're in your school library, which I went to look and I think, oops, sorry, my thing is, okay, there we go. I went to look and I think all of these were actually in the school library that I work at. So that was good. Because I
Mhm.
was like, are these accessible to the kids that I teach? Can they go get to the school library? And so to give credit to like libraries try. really,
Librarians are generally awesome humans. Some of them suck, I'm
right,
sure. 'Cause they're
right,
humans, right? But librarians are generally really awesome at
it's
trying
really
to
hard.
bring in the community and provide a wide range of books and
Yeah,
have new stuff and old stuff and different modalities. I mean, that I libraries are so awesome. So it hurts me every time I hear like one is closed,
yeah, and that's
especially one that is serving a community like that.
so like the librarians go out of their way to try to bring in as much, but they're not giving the money to do it. Like they can only do as much as they can with the finances that they're giving, the budget that they're giving. And as we know, politically speaking in this country, um libraries are not important. Apparently, we don't care about libraries. Who cares? Because they're free and they're public and everyone can use them because they're not part of the capitalist system that makes money. Libraries don't make money for anyone. Like I literally, and I tell this as a joke, but it is not a joke. I take my time taking my library books back because I know that my fees will at least go somewhere good. Like, I'm willing to give you money, library. Here, take it, late fees. Like, I'm like, I'll just keep this.
I'll pay late.
I'll pay the late
Yeah.
fees because I know that'll go to something to the library. But I mean, it's just, and so like reading these, which were really great. I was talking about how the when the moonlight meets the mountain, when the mountain meets the moon, is all total fables, just complete 100% fables, folklore, and it's written in a style where the main character, this little Minley, this little cutie girl here, female main character too, which was great. Also, like
Hmm.
maybe she's about 10. I don't think she's even that old. Like goes on this whole adventure by herself, and leaves like her parents behind, and then like her adventure follows like with the mythology. Like so, like as she's going, there's like a folk tale told, and it sort of like goes with where what's happening with her, and they all connected, which I also thought was really interesting. Because if we talk about whatever mythology we might have, we might have like in the American culture might have, they don't connect in the same way a lot of mythology from other cultures do, which I think is really interesting. Like for Hispanic, we have some that connect. This one, a lot of theirs connect together. Maya's African folklore, and like Tristan is West African specifically, and they all connect. Like Anansi, which I'd heard of, that's like the one god in this particular, and John Henry were like was the two that I'd heard of, like as myth, like folklore characters and like mythology characters that I'd heard of myself, like as an adult. But also knew that there were tons of Anansi stories. Like I knew because he was a trickster and they had all this different like stories. So I just found it really interesting how different culturally we are. But kids don't know that if they can't read that. Like they have no clue how different all these other cultures are, and all how their stories are different and similar. Some of things are similar. Like the main idea of this was she decides to go find her fortune for her family because her mom is really interesting. Her mom's kind of like always moaning about them not having enough money, and just or always being like angry about it. It's letting her gets making her bitter, and just upset when she sees other people have more than they do and all that. And she's not sort of like happy with like the really lovely daughter she has, and her husband's a good guy and he works hard, and like he tries or whatever. And it was interesting because it's like really the story is about her mom learning a lesson, not just her. Like when she disappears, then her mom's like, oh my gosh, right? Like, no, 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 my daughter's the thing that I love, right? I mean, it's really interesting, and I like the way that it happened. Like it kind of came on because she learned the same thing, like on her journey. Like money's not gonna really, right? Like that's not gonna really make us necessarily happy or whatever. It was really interesting. It was really well done, but it was all very like old school folklore, which I really enjoyed. And then Maya and the Rising Dark is about this girl who is that one, and like Tristan Strong is the chosen one trope almost. Maya not so much because she's part of a bigger community, but she's like the guardian of the veil, so she's like supposed to be, when she grows up, the guardian between this world and the other, and make sure not, none of the bad stuff gets in, blah blah blah. But there's a whole community of people. Like, she's not like the only one, right? Everybody does their part or whatever, which I thought that's a great thing to have. In because a lot of times when you have these fantasy novels, you don't get that, like the chosen one, right? You're the only one kind of thing. So I thought that was really good. And both Maya and Tristan are series, so that's good too. They're gonna continue on. They have not beaten the bad guy yet or whatever. And Tristan Strong was and so Maya was more like our world, and then in it were like, fantasy creatures in our world. But Tristan Strong is literally going to the fantasy world. And so that's why they were also very, very different, which I'm glad I chose 3 different types of fantasy. And his was way enjoyable. Like, I mean, I enjoyed all of them, but I really quite enjoy his whole thing. But I think I mentioned it's because his also came in with grief. Like the whole idea of learning how to deal with the grief you have when you lose somebody you love. And I liked that it wasn't, what I liked the most wasn't that, and not that this isn't important because it happens, but I liked that with Tristan, it wasn't like losing a parent, which is hard and terrible. But like, he lost his best friend. So he lost a kid his age. And it was like, that's different. Like, I was like, oh, that's a different way of showing grief, because, while the other one is also bad, that's a different type of grief. Completely, or whatever. And it was, I don't know, it was I just finished that one earlier, and it was really, I listened to that one more than in the others. I read the other ones, I listened to that one, and the narrator for that one was fantastic.
Nice.
It was really good. Like, I enjoyed it. But so I'm reading, and it's so interesting because every single one of these people, every single one, when I read what the authors had to say, which is where we're coming into, every single one of these authors wrote this because they did not have this when they were kids. Every single one of them. They were like, yeah, this didn't exist when I was a kid, so I decided might as well, right? Gracelyn specifically said when she was a kid, they didn't have any of these, so she lost interest in her culture.
And you were telling me about that.
Yes, she said that while she's, obviously at home and everything, they obviously still spoke, like her cultural language. I can't remember what it is right now. And her mom obviously would speak, talk to her and everything. She was not interested in any way in like her culture, because she was so like, everything that she had was the white culture around her. And so like, that was really what she read or whatever. So she lost total interest in her culture. And then like, as she got older, she was like, right? Like, she was like, she was kind of upset with herself. And then that's when she decided to kind of look up all the folklores. Like, and then that, when she was learning about it, was like, no, I want to write something in this world, or like, that brings this culture, which I thought was really interesting. That didn't happen to Kwame or Rena, so I thought that was really, like, she literally lost interest in her culture because she didn't have her culture represented. She was a kid, like, she didn't see it anywhere, so I got no interest, right? And it's just
if
like,
I see it's cool, might as well just be interested in that.
And so that's really, really important, at least to me. Like, I think, mine's a different, not everyone has the kind of childhood that I had growing up, right? I literally grew up in a house, like we had like a 2-3 story house where like my aunt owned it, and we lived on one floor, and my aunt lived on another floor, and then we had other family live in the other floor. So I was surrounded 24/7 by my culture. Like, I had like, like, I couldn't walk out the door without somebody talking to me about something. So, and I spent my, like, from when I was 6 to when I was about 15 or 16, I spent every summer in Puerto Rico. Not like, I did not miss a summer. Lie, I missed my 15th birthday, but that's because my mom was like, you can have a quinceañera, you can go to Disney World, and I said Disney World. So like, I do not want to wear a dress. I do not want to do any of that. Let's go to Disney World. So that's like the only summer we didn't. We spent like a month in Florida because I had family out there who like owned a house and everything, and so they let us stay with them. But that was like the one summer I did not go to Puerto Rico. But so I got lucky, and obviously my parents spoke Spanish at home, but they were both, they're both fluent English speakers, and so like they also, they didn't push me speaking Spanish at home, but because I was surrounded with so many people, I just did, right? It wasn't like a thing I had to do at home. Um, but if you're isolated, like so many immigrant families tend to be because there are families somewhere else, and if you don't have that community, you absolutely are going to lose that culture, or like even that like wanting to know about that culture. So I found hers the most compelling like reason why. And then Renee and Kwame both were like, yeah, we didn't see ourselves in any books growing up. So especially knowing how rich their culture was in mythology, especially fantasy, specifically fantasy, they were like, yeah, no, we wanted to write something where, we could talk about that. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad that's happening. I'm so glad that's happening in middle grade. It was Peele, right? I think it is Peele that did it. And he's the one that wrote and directed Get Out, wrote and directed Us, is writing and directing a third one. And it's all obviously very like own voices, right? And like in a horror, like, which is like he chose the horror genre, which I thought was brilliant because there's not enough in any way, shape, or form in the like horror genre to speak of. Like, people of color tend to die fairly quickly.
Well, so have you ever noticed? So I guess this is the thing about horror. Yes, it's usually all white people. If there's a black character, you would assume they would make the black character the murdering villain. They don't.
No,
It's just some dead body,
right,
right? Early dead.
right.
And so it's so funny to me that in horror, which is like an expression of things we're actually afraid of, we're still like as a society really afraid of the white psychopath because we are the white psychopath.
Right. It says a lot, right? It says a lot. It does say a lot.
I feel like psychiatrists probably have a field day with that one, and we just haven't read that, like Atlantic think piece yet. But somebody needs to write that. Somebody way more qualified than I.
And they talk about how people have, and it's also because people have literal like lose their minds when you dare to like represent like a culture that's not white. And like, do you remember like we talked about this in class? I don't know if you were around, but when the Hunger Games came out.
Oh yeah. Oh, the movies, the lashing out about Rue, and like even Katniss, like olive complexion and all of that stuff because the author actually like wrote about race and they couldn't handle it.
Like I was like I remember no, but like, and I think in class our Dr. Ryan showed like all these tweets and people talking about it and being like, them just being so whatever. And I'm like, I feel as a teacher that we have failed you in reading comprehension, because very clearly in this book they say that Rue has dark skin, like, and like very clearly she's a black child. Like, I don't know what happened to your reading comprehension. And let's be real, the girl that they put to be Rue was not dark as Rue was described in that book.
Still. Nope. She passed the brown bag test. Sorry. Let's be real.
Yes, but she was still too dark. And I'm just like, and I'm like, and not just her, but like her entire district was black, like it was a black community. Like it was very clearly said in that book that they were. And I was like, that's what blew my mind. I'm like, are you serious? Like it was in the book. Like in the book, she was black. Like,
Well, And it's also so like the whitewashing and the need to have the story whitewashed. You remember the Ghost in the Shell?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That was another one. Hmm.
Right? I'm sorry, Scarlett Johansson's gonna do what now?
Right. Exactly. And to her, like, things she did, I mean, she's not, and that's what gets you mad. You can't get mad at the actors. They're going out to
Just
try to get.
want good stories.
No, they just, yes, she specifically wanted a good story, right? Like an action story that she could, do. Specifically wanted that. But like, you can't blame them for going out and looking for a job. You blame the people in charge who are hiring them when they shouldn't.
Who's doing the casting? And that's the thing, right? Who's picking the stories? This is what gets us back to the thing before we were
Yes.
talking about with the publishing.
Yes.
Who's picking
The
the
story.
story?
Yes.
Who's doing that?
Right.
Because if the people picking the story all have like bringing in the danger of a single story, if they have a single story and they expect and they're picking what they respond to as a reader, they are not gonna have a breadth of experience in their stories. It's
No.
gonna be the same shit over and over. When you have a monocultural selection process, you have a monocultural
And that's
publishing process.
and that's where we fall into. If we want a change in publishing, then the behind the scenes in publishing has to change. So like, not only do we need to have inclusive characters in books, you have to have an inclusive staff. Like, you need to hire people who are not one culture, right? You need to hire more behind there, but it is still such a male dominated white man, like,
Straight,
business, straight
cis,
white man
white
business.
male.
Yeah, it's still so much that. I mean, we're making slow inroads in there, but it is still so highly, and you don't have, we talked about this last time, you don't always have allies like Rick Riordan, right? We talked.
So we were talking about the Rick Riordan thing
Yeah.
and how he's lifting as he climbs people who are not him. He's lifting own voices that are not him. So one of the things I went to my shelf to dig out,
Funny.
I think is One Trick Pony. It is a graphic novel by Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale is sort of a historian writer, but he does a lot of graphic novels about like the truth about history. Um, he actually did one about the Haitian Revolution. I think it just came out.
Ooh,
And
okay.
he came to the school I used to work at, and actually signed this for me in like 2018 because he was doing a thing with our students about his books. So one of the things that I was like, okay, this was really awesome in 2018. Yes, white dude writer,
Hmm.
but the nearly the entire human being cast is people of color, like ostensibly because it is right. It is it's graphic novel. Like there's our main character, very definitely a person
Color.
of color.
Right.
Her parents, the chief of her tribe, also the chief of her tribe is sort of coded like a Native American, um, and it's like post-apocalyptic. And there's only like one tribe of ostensibly white people, and they're running around like Vikings, and they become the bad guys pretty often, and the or pretty quickly, and then the aliens that are invading their planet are very much like colonialists. They're just gobbling resources and they go from planet to planet and gobble resources, right? And they're literally gobbling them. They're literally eating
Yeah.
things. And they're
Yeah.
going to get through all of the technology and we're done eating the technology. They're going to eat the people.
Ooh. Wow.
And it's just like, you're like, okay, Nathan Hale, you're trying really, really hard here
Yeah.
to do like the good thing, to voice the real problems. But like, white dude.
Right. Right.
White dude already gotten famous publishing the history of other white dudes.
Right.
So like yes, and that was a big thing that came out in 2018. It's 2021, right? What are the big things coming out now? Yes, we've still got Kwame Alexander and Jason Reynolds who are like powerhouses of black male publishing, right?
Right.
Um but where are, like, we need diverse books is still trying to get a lot published. Those are some of the other diverse things for middle grades I was going to bring out. For instance, like a lot of the short story anthologies are all coming from Own Voices diverse writers.
Right.
And those have been coming out for about 5, 6 years now,
Mm-hmm.
possibly longer. Um, and those anthologies are great for short stories. They're actually like really nice for teachers to be able to like pick a short story and put it out with their kids, like go over it in class and read it and things like that. Um, Contemporary, Own Voices, diverse. There was a one that my kids really loved. It was from the New Beginnings. It was by a Filipina author who was talking about the Pacific Islander history, like the vampire character that they have called an Aswang. It was really interesting. It was cool. The kids really liked it.
Good.
Um, but it's, I mean, it's one of those things that like this was sort of groundbreaking.
Right.
Why?
Right.
Um, and now we've got like other stuff. Like we're still trying like as teachers who are encouraging readers and trying to encourage the publishing industry to do what we want so that we have the materials that we need for class. Like those are the ways that you and I are trying to spend our energy. Right?
Right.
Clearly we all have books that we are purchasing. I'll be honest, I haven't bought a book in a real long time. Um, but that's like one of the things that we're constantly trying to do. We need the right material for our class. One of the other things that I think is really interesting is when it comes to YA and adult fiction, there was a parallel publishing industry. It was not nearly as strong as what we grew up, like finding in the Barnes and Noble. But I mean, it's really starting to become more apparent to people like you and I
Mhm.
that there are all of these Black authors who've been out there publishing these Black stories, and there was very little crossover,
Very.
right? Like I used to work in a bookstore, and one of the things that I saw crossover was like Sister Soldier,
Oh,
right?
yes. Yeah.
That was one of the few things that crossed over. And now that like I know this, I'm like opening my eyes to this huge pile of literature that I had no idea was there
Right.
because it
I
never
mean,
ended up in the library or the Barnes and Noble.
and you had and that's the thing. You had maybe your like one that would come over, like Octavia Butler, who's not known nearly as much as she should be, but she
He
made
should
it
be should
through.
be
She should be known way
yes.
better than she is. But like,
Yes.
she actually made it past and through, right? Like a little bit and was able to get into like mainstream. But she's like one of hundreds, right? And even then, she's not known as well as she should be known at all. And that, I mean, and that's
No.
exactly like for years and years, you've had all these like Black authors telling their stories, and nobody's, you know, using what they have to push it up. Like that's, like what's groundbreaking now is what Rick Riordan is doing, which is pushing up people that are like not him, telling other stories and pushing them up and being like, here you go, right? Like these are the stories you need to be reading. And then like what needs to be groundbreaking of that is that you shouldn't need him to do that. He should not do that. That should not be on him. Like he should continue to do what he does because he really likes to have stories out there. But like this should be on the publishing people. Like you as a publisher should automatically be picking these people up. He should not have to be. He should not have to form his own. What do we call it? Not label. I forget what it's called. But he shouldn't have had to form his own, stamp or whatever.
No, I know exactly what you mean. It's imprint, his own
Yeah,
imprint.
he shouldn't have to make his own imprint and then like to like that should have been something that you should have thought of. I'm glad that he did. I'm
Oh, but
glad
he's
he still
not
does.
the only one. Like even comedian Phoebe Robinson now has her own imprint.
Right. Yes.
So that she can publish things that she's like, no, this should be published.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that over and over again people of color and people trying to do the ally thing right are trying to find ways to make sure that what happened when we were young doesn't happen again,
Right.
right? Because right now everybody's trying to lift diverse voices and, talk
Well, and
about,
having
make
and
sure that there's a black person involved at the table and Asian
you and
people
I
and all
talk
those other
about this, right? The more progress we make, the bigger that like swing back goes. And it'll swing back all
backlash.
the way again eventually, right? But here we go. We're talking about how much people are pushing to have our like own voices out there. And what is specifically Texas doing? Banning every freaking thing they can find. Like, and I'm talking specifically about Texas because they're the ones that are legitimately losing their minds right now and just have lost it completely. But like, and there's other places, obviously, but like,
Well, because if it works in Texas, they become it becomes a roll down the hill, right?
exactly,
Everybody else is going to try to
exactly.
do the
And
same thing.
and when we were talking about, there was this thing I read where like this politician, obviously, was like talking about like, we should basically trying to say we should ban books that are going to make our children feel uncomfortable. Or I'm like, you want to ban every single book because books
I
will make
saw
children
that.
feel uncomfortable. But if you want me to
That's
talk to
part of
you,
the plot graph.
right, exactly. Like that is part of how you tell a story. Like I think it makes them feel uncomfortable or talks about things that they are not ready for and blah blah blah. All this, the mumbo jumbo that came out of his mouth was just like ridiculous. But my first thought was, can I talk to you as a white Christian man? Then we ban the Bible, because trust me, a lot of stuff that happens in the Bible makes children uncomfortable. Like, but how soon are you gonna ban the Bible? You're not gonna. It's just stupid. Like and God knows I would never say ban anything. Like, do not ban the Bible. Like, no. But like it's just, like it's, I read that and literally shook. I had the same. I'm like, that's part of telling a plot. You're supposed to make people uncomfortable. Like,
If the main character isn't uncomfortable, there's no growth. It's like, oh my God, do you remember? There's this, and we must have watched it in high school, but there was this documentary, I think, about censorship of uh the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
yes.
And at one point, they showed an adaptation of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which was basically just Huckleberry Finn going down the river on his raft, fishing, and waving to people on the banks. And like at one point, he waves to Jim, or like Jim is rowing in the back or something like that. But like there's no interaction. Like Tom Sawyer pops out of a bush and like waves back. I was like, what the fuck is this? They're so uncomfortable about everything about that novel because it points out so many really problematic things while still supporting racism, because that is Huck's major conflict.
Right.
To be racist and support slavery, or to be racist and not support slavery.
Right.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
I mean, it could have possibly been Mark Twain's own inner turmoil going on in that, to be racist and not support slavery, to be racist and support it. I don't know. Yeah. I mean,
He was pretty against,
right.
but still dealing with his own like inherent racism. But he also saw, right, if you look at the Adventures of Tom Sawyer, it is a much more clearly anti-racist
Right. Yeah.
piece of work than Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
Which
I
is
mean, but
why
that's gross, right? That's gross. But yeah. And we talk about, like, you talk about that too, which is another thing, which is why these are so. I just saw something from someone called mirror windows and sliding doors. And I thought that was such an interesting way to say it. Mirror windows and
what mirrored windows and sliding doors. Interesting.
because mirror obviously is what you're looking at, right? The window's looking out, but the sliding door is you stepping through. And I was like, that's brilliant. Like, and so like if you don't have these books to step through, how is these children who are in a culture that is inherently phobic of anything that is different, whether you're queer, whether you're black, whether you're like Latinx, whether like anything that is not the normal, and I'll say that with a quotation because nothing's normal. That is not a real thing, right? That is a completely made up thing. But like, how are they supposed to know if they can't experience things? Like, that's just like it, like it, that's the thing that drives me crazy. Um the sliding door thing was, I just saw that and I was like, that's brilliant. I love that. I'm gonna have to go back and like read the actual article. It was the author talking about the article that she wrote in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote this in the 90s. I can't even like remember like how, or maybe early mid 90s she wrote this particular article. I need to go find it. But I was like, that's just, I love the way that that was said. But like, if kids can't experience other people's lives, they can't not be racist, which is the point. That's the point, right? That's the point of you
So
trying to stop it. Like, you don't want that to change. You don't want our kids to be like, no, that's not okay. And it's so hard. You talk about this a lot, being like a white person growing a white person growing up in this culture, that you had to unlearn behavior. I have to unlearn behavior. Like, we talk about this all the time. Now, as a woman, I am, it's funny because I think maybe for me as a Latinx, right, or something, it might be different. As a woman, I am nervous when any man is walking behind me. I am inherently more nervous when a white man is walking behind me, right? Just my own fear. But I'm also nervous when a black man is walking behind me. I'm also nervous, I mean, generally a man walking behind me, but you know what I mean? Like, and
yeah.
that is a fear you got taught, right? That's a fear you're taught. You're like more nervous sometimes. And that's something I had to teach myself to like stop and not be afraid. Like, it's just, it's hard. It's hard to, because I mean, you would think people that are not white would not be racist, and that's BS. We all are. Like, it's just an actual part of our culture, our
Yeah,
society.
no. And you grew up inured in it, right? Like you're just dripping in it, right? What is that line? Fish don't know that water is wet or something along those
Yes,
lines.
yes,
They
right.
don't fish don't know what water is because it's
In
just
it.
around them and inside them. It's just their lives. Um and I think that's fair. And you have, like, as you're right, as a white person, I have to look around and be like, oh yeah, that's right. That's my thing. That's the lens I'm looking through. That's I have to be more aware of that. I have to think about that more. And I think that a lot of people aren't comfortable, right? And this gets back to that politician you were talking about. They're not comfortable because they don't want to see that the choices they've made have had consequences,
Right.
and that those choices were taught to them over and over again, which is where the vitriolic response comes from to some of these things that you and I just find so baffling. Um, and and one of the things that, I mean, God love Toni Morrison. She's so brilliant, so brilliant. I'm so sad she's gone, but rest in power, ma'am. Um, but she talked about how, like, psychologically damaged you have to be to only be able to see the other, right, as less than you so that you can feel secure in your being more than somebody else.
Right.
Right? If you have to step on somebody else's neck to feel big, and tell yourself that you are good just as you are, you don't have to step on that person's neck, but you're clearly stepping on that person's neck, right? And it just warps your mind. And I think that that's one of the things that, and this gets back to what I was saying about the horror movie stuff, like, white people's minds, mine included, are so warped by the expectation of power and privilege and not seeing it because we can't see it because then we have to see what we're doing to get it and keep it.
Right.
That's
Right.
what we want, right? I was reading this article earlier today that was talking about how so much of even the language that we used to colonize this country was um, came from military verbiage. Apparently pioneer, which I didn't know, pioneer was a term for surf cannon fodder that you would send out ahead to clear the path through like woods or find a place to ford streams so that the actual army could get through. And so the pioneers that we sent out west
Right. That's what they did. Like
That's
that's
what
what
they did, and
yeah,
we sent them to violate treaties so that the wealthy people who wanted to go buy up huge chunks of land once we claimed them and had cleared them of, vicious savages who were killing the pioneers who we sent there to get killed.
right.
And I was like, "Oh my god, there's so much about everything that's so horrible."
Right. And these
Um
are the things, and these are the things that we need to be able to teach our kids. Right. What you're
yes.
saying. If we could have those specifically, the indigenous people, the black people, the Latinx people, like the queer people, if we could have them talk, if you allow them to speak, like this kind of stuff that you and I had to look for
Mhm.
to learn about, because we are like, nope, I want to know more. Right. But not everyone's like us. Like, not everyone's like that. And not everyone has that mentality of, man, this is weird. I need to find out more about this. This can't be right. Like, not everyone's like that. Like, that's
A lot of people don't want to know. They actively
no.
don't want to know
Yeah.
because, just as that politician was saying, it makes them uncomfortable
Right.
to know that it wasn't fair.
Right.
That
And
you aren't what you are because you are so goddamn awesome, or everybody has a chance to be like you and you just happen to be top of the pile. You just happen to have this enormous McMansion and a shitload of debt you can't really pay off in your lifetime. But that's fine.
right. Well, and I think, and so I'm like, I'm again relieved by all these good books that are coming out, hoping that we get
Yeah.
way more, hoping the trend continues. And I think it will, as these people get older, right? And they move on to young adult and move on to adult. We will, and I'm not saying that young adult and adult, new adult, specifically new adult or adult, don't have inclusion, but theirs is a lot more segregated.
It is very segregated. It's only, I
In
feel like those walls
middle grade,
only
I
come
give
with
them
debt.
credit. Middle grade is not segregated in the same way, which is why I'm like, yay, like, right? It's not segregated in the same way, but it is very segregated in young adults, very segregated in like adult and new adult, like very, right, very specifically. Um, right? It's like it's a whole thing, but like I'm hoping that that's a thing that continues, because I see my kids, right? And I was talking about this the other day, how I had two of my fifth graders come out to me, right? One told me she was bisexual and one told me he was gay. And that was because I'm fairly open about my own queerness, right? I don't hide it from my kids. And if anybody has a problem with it, come at me. I'll take you to court. It's fine. But like, like, I mean, like a parent hasn't come up and said anything and the school hasn't said anything. I'm still awaiting. This district's a little weird, but that's another story. Um, but like my kids know I'm fairly like, I don't like them to judge anybody. I don't like any of that. We talk about this, but I didn't even have to have this conversation with my kids. Like, when the kids came out, like, they told their friends. I don't think they told everybody, but then like one of them, like one of the little girl that came out, like the little girl. And so she was kind of like talking to her or whatever. And all the kids were like, they were exactly the same day they would be if it was a straight kid after. Yeah,
Oh,
you're just like, oh my gosh. I'm like, I mean, and I was like so relieved in a way, because these are like, that's 28 little souls in this room who are seeing the world the way it needs to be seen. Not like, like they see things in a completely, like, it goes back to saying the kids are not born racist, right? Kids are not born phobic. They're taught that. And if they grow up in a world where it's not okay to be those things, they themselves are not going to be those things. They realize, nah, that's not okay. Right? We had a kid say, you know, something to my boy, who, something like derogatory about it, and my kids were ticked. Like, my class was mad, and they immediately told his teacher. They were just, and I was like, yay, that's
good.
great, right? Because I already know these kids who sit next to each other don't see, they see the difference in each other, but it doesn't matter. Does that make sense? Like, they know, right? But to them, it's just, my friend is my friend. I don't, whatever, right? And I like that. I'm like, and again, we talk about these kids are not, we're taught these things. We're not like inherently born this way. And so I'm working on gender at the moment. I'm working on, please, please let's not. Like what is it? One of the boys said something about pink is a girl color. And we had a moment where we had a come to Jesus moment. I was like, okay, colors don't have genders. I was like, nothing in a color is, I was like, no. No.
It is a societal construct.
The
I actually
fire burns bright.
Sorry. I told a student of mine recently about like they were like, "Oh, well, pink." And I was like, "You know, pink actually used to be the color of boys, right? Because
Yeah.
red was seen as a masculine color, and since pink was the lighter version of red, it was for baby boys, and baby girls got blue, baby blue." And and they were like, "What?"
Like,
Yeah.
I told my
Yeah.
boy, I said, I'm gonna tell you right here, right now. I think pink looks the best on boys. I was like, because it does. It looks beautiful. I think it looks really nice on guys a lot most of the time. And so I'm like, but I was like, but there's no like we talk about. There's no gender in toys. I was like, there's not a girl toy. There's not a boy toy. I said, but inherently, if a boy plays with the doll, they're seen as weird. I said, would you think it's weird if a girl picked up a basketball? And the boys were like, no. And I'm like, what's the difference? I was like, so we had a long conversation about gender, which I'm like, that's my next step. Like, let's like get away from the construct of that. That
Yeah.
again is also a thing. So
I said something to my kids too about like the man box, because a lot of it's always phrased as like, don't put females in a box. But having worked at a boys' school for a while, right? We talked about how males are hurt by gender stereotypes too. Right? Like you aren't allowed to show your feelings, you can't play with certain things, you can't enjoy certain activities. And really what I was trying to get at is like the whole feelings bit of it, because that is the most constipating, harmful part of the man box, right? In order to be a man, you have to like shut down your feelings. You can't cry. The only anger you can express is like, the only feeling you can express really is anger. You can't express fear. You can't express sadness. You can't, like, even your joy has to sort of be at inappropriate comedy.
mm-hmm.
Right? And so we talked a little bit about that, and how like it hurts both of us. It hurts everybody. I shouldn't say both. It hurts everybody. This idea that to be male, or to be man, masculine, to be female, to be feminine, whatever, however you're going to break it down, like those ideas hurt people. Yes, they hurt people who don't fit into either camp.
Right.
But
Right.
they really hurt people just in general, across the board.
Yeah.
And if you're going to put somebody else, like if you're putting yourself in the box, if you're forcing other people to get in the box with you so that you feel better about your choice, you are fucking it up.
Yep. Pretty much.
Yeah.
So
I do like working with older kids now, so I can say fucking shit again.
yeah.
I missed that about the middle grades. I was like, okay, fine. I won't say certain things. I'll be good.
Yeah.
And I was really good. And now, like, when I bust it out and I'm like, get your fucking shit together today, kids are like, oh. And I'm like, ah, so freeing.
It is.
So freeing.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for all this.
You're totally welcome.